thrilled to get to talk to you about it tonight. I wanted, you and I talked a few days ago on the phone about the book and about tonight's conversation. And one of the things I said to you that really struck me so much about this book and makes it such a particularly special and impressive achievement is it manages to be at once a very broad story and a very specific story. So you have kind of the story of Napoleonic Europe, which is an absolutely crazy, unprecedented time in European history, also treated by such luminaries as Tolstoy. So it's not an easy thing to get a feel for, and yet you cover kind of the cultural and political consequences of Napoleon's ravaging of Europe on the heels of the French Revolution, and then what the kind of cultural politics were back in France resulting from those forays. And at the same time, you tell the story of the migration of this one very important and very special painting. And so I was wondering if you could start tonight by just talking to us a bit about why, of all of the many, many hundreds of works of art the Napoleonic army looted during their European campaigns, why did you choose this one in particular? And can you tell us a bit more about it, please?
Yeah, and we're going to, I'll answer that, but then we're going to look at the painting. And well, I think that the theft of this painting by the French is emblematic of Napoleon's whole art plundering project. And in a way, by focusing on one painting and explaining the significance of that, I could explain the significance of the loss to Venice.
Yeah.
And then also its importance to Paris and the influence it had on French painting. And often before, people have focused on all the art he took from Rome, because that was considered the greatest works of art in the 18th century, all those antiquities. And yet I realized by the time they arrived in Paris, that taste for those antiquities had started to pass. It was passed. And so, and that the Veronese was really the work of art that had the most influence on the French painting in the 19th century.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's a staggeringly, and you describe it so beautifully. I mean, you write so beautifully and perceptively about the visual arts, obviously, but it's a surprise. It's a painting that that I've seen before plenty of times. Never particularly thought about the plundering history, to my shame, but it's a surprisingly modern painting in many ways, and it's a really impressive. It represents a really impressive convergence of particular traditions and then the unique talents of Veronese. So maybe now's the time for you to show us the painting and talk to us a little bit more about it and Veronese.
Great. Yes, but I first I should say, Caroline, your books are models to me. They are. They've made fantastic contributions to the history of France, but they're also so beautifully written and very witty. So rare and appreciated.
Likewise. Okay, mutual admiration, and now,
Here we go. So here it is.
Yeah.
The Wedding Feast of Cana. So this is a huge and absolutely beautiful canvas, 33 feet wide, 22 feet tall, painted by Veronese in 1563 to fill the entire end wall of the refectory of the monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. And the French tore this down from the wall of the monastery in 1797. They rolled it up, they packed it into a crate, and they loaded it onto a ship and had it transported to France. And 4 years later, it went up at the Louvre. Now, the subject of the painting, it had become the custom in northern Italy for monasteries to decorate their refectories with a picture of a New Testament feast. And the most famous was in Milan, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And the Wedding Feast of Cana is another biblical feast, but completely different because it is the most festive of biblical feasts. Jesus attends a wedding and the host runs out of wine, and miraculously Jesus turns water into wine. But what's wonderful is that Veronese sets the biblical scene in his own 16th century Venice. There are over 130 figures, many of them life-size, and he dresses these figures in silks and other fabrics for which Venice was famous. And he sets it on a terrace. Above it's another terrace, and then he frames the whole scene in his soaring Renaissance architecture. So in addition to being a biblical feast, it's also a portrait of Venetian society and a portrait of Venice. And I think what's most important to the French was that Veronese demonstrates his brilliant use of color and his ability to create the illusion of reality. So it seems as though the scene is taking place almost on a stage right in front of the viewer. And there are these also these wonderful details, these illusionistic details, like all the brocades with light playing over them. And in the late 17th century, a French critic called this all but the triumph of painting itself. And I really can't disagree.
Yeah, no, yeah, and you've got some beautiful quotes at the end of your book, like, that's not painting, it's magic. And you make the case for that magic, and the painting makes a case for itself. I think one of the fascinating things about the fact that it was built for that particular refectory and that particular monastery was the architecture of the monastery itself, right? So Palladio had designed, if I'm remembering correctly, the refectory.
That's right. Yes, just before they commissioned this painting, the abbot had commissioned Palladio to redesign the refectory, and he creates this beautiful, long, white, narrow stucco room with windows on both sides. And the fascinating thing is that originally the painting was filled the entire end of that room, and Veronese made it appear that the room was opening up and that this feast was taking place on a terrace just outside. So, so Palladio, he really worked with Palladio's architecture, but Palladio's architecture, the entire room framed the Veronese.
Yeah, which just makes it that much more of a heartbreak to see this particular work ripped out of its context. Now, can you talk a little bit about the sort of the French, beyond the what you just mentioned about how kind of the taste for classical antiquity was already fading a bit by the time this painting arrives and then is shown in the Louvre. How is Veronese special from the point of view of the French? Because there was an interesting and kind of storied history, right, about Veroneses in important French collections and Veroneses in France.
Yes, absolutely. And when I think about this painting, I usually think it has its history has two segments: 200 years in Italy, 200 some years, and then 200 some years in France. But in fact, the history of this painting goes much further back, because it's really part of France's long love affair with the art of Italy. And Louis XIV actually tried to buy this painting in the 1660s. And his ambassador had been told to buy paintings, the ambassador in Venice, buy paintings for Louis XIV. And this was the very first one he tried to buy, and the monks would not sell it to him. So he settled on a smaller, lesser Veronese feast. When he acquired it, he put it in a stateroom in Versailles. But Louis XIV would end up with 22 Veroneses, or at least one part that were attributed to Veronese.
Yeah.
And the Duc d'Orléans, his cousin, who had this fabulous collection in the Palais Royal, he had 29 Veroneses. So there was the French had been very enthusiastic about Veronese. And I even think of this. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you even think of it as?
Well, also the whole French passion for the art of Italy goes back further to Francis I.
Sure.
Where, he's fighting the Austrians in Italy, in Milan, just like Napoleon, and he sees the Last Supper in the refectory in Santa Maria della Grazia, and he can't take the Last Supper because it's actually painted on the wall. It's not a canvas.
Too bad.
But he then invites Leonardo to come to France, to his court. And then, of course, Leonardo spends the last years of his life in Amboise.
Right. And you give such a great kind of mini art historical lesson when talking about Veronese and the kind of the convergence of, and what the French appreciated so much was this spectacular use of color, but also this really sophisticated disegno, this use of kind of design and drawing. And that while other Renaissance masters were maybe really great at disegno, Veronese sort of adds this whole virtuoso treatment of color that made it special. It was really fun to see these lists of these collections, these important French collections from before the Revolution, and to see, as you mentioned, how significant Veronese was in those collections.
Yeah, and I think that this combination of disegno and color came because Veronese's, his father was a stone carver, and he'd been trained to sculpt stone before he was trained as a painter. And I think you can see this in these very sculptural figures.
Yeah, yeah. And then just you talk also about the kind of the dyes and the pigments that, you know, Venice is famous for its textiles, but that those same pigments were so important for the paint colors that he was using too. And that is just glorious.
Well, it's amazing because, you know, there's a contract. They have the contract for this painting still exists. And what was wonderful is to see the abbot is very sophisticated. And I think like many Venetian patrons, very sophisticated in his demands. And he says the Veronese has to paint the picture, not just hand it off to one of his assistants, but also that he used the very finest colors. And he can say that because in Venice was a market for color, as you say, for color and dye, pigments and dyes. And he was able to get these absolutely the finest colors, and including ultramarine, which was the most expensive color, the most expensive blue, the most beautiful blue, made of powdered lapis lazuli, and wow. It was imported from Afghanistan, but it wasn't available everywhere in Europe. It was just, yeah. It certainly was.
But at a trade hub like Venice, yeah. And you also point out, and I'd never thought about this before either, but that actually one of the reasons the colors, I mean, obviously much, and we can maybe talk a little bit more about what happened to this painting physically, and then the restoration job that different people had after its plunder, but also just the idea that this incredibly high quality, high pigment and paint allowed the colors to last much longer than other old master or other Renaissance paintings, where the colors, less good paints, kind of faded over time in terms of their intensity.
But not, yeah, absolutely, and sometimes they reacted with each other, and blues in particular, and conservators were so interesting because they would emphasize to me that the Renaissance painters were really never wasted anything, and they didn't like to spend, you know, if there was a cheaper blue, they would use the cheaper blue rather than the more expensive blue. So that's one of the reasons probably that the abbot insisted on it, and the blues in the skies in which the Veronese painted with smalt, which was the least expensive blue, made from cobalt glass that was made in Venice in Murano. They turned gray and brown. You can see this. It's sad.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit maybe now about the sort of why Napoleon just took it upon himself to plunder the rest of Europe for its art. What were his motives? What were the origins of that practice of plunder for the French, maybe in particular? And then also, what did he know about art? How did he make these choices about art? I mean, those are all wonderful parts of the story that you tell in this book.
Well, he plundered, I think, above all, to aggrandize himself and build an image of his military power and his political power. And I think he took this from the French kings because he could see that they had used art and architecture to build their political power, or build the image of their political power, particularly Louis XIV, of course.
Yeah, yeah. But as you say, also François Ier, I mean, he got routed in Italy. He was held prisoner by the Spanish, and yet he comes back to France and he just starts the French Renaissance in many ways. So, you know, it is impressive what these monarchs were able to do to build their prestige through culture. And you're right, Napoleon seems to have been extremely aware of that. But that's an interesting thing too, given that you also make the point and tell very helpfully the history of how Napoleon came up through the revolution, really. I mean, he made his career as a revolutionary general and famously said, "I am the revolution." So what do you make of this this uncomfortable convergence in Napoleon between these revolutionary ideals that he was supposedly bringing across Europe and enhancing in France the values of the Enlightenment, and then this kind of imperialistic, because Napoleon, I mean, Louis XIV himself was thinking about the Roman emperors and their use of culture to enhance their prestige. So tell us a little bit about that, about the kind of the crazy patchwork quilt of Napoleon's influences and ambitions.
Yes, and he's very ambitious, you know, from the moment in that Italian campaign. And this Italian campaign, one of the other reasons to focus in his plundering on the art of Italy is this is where he really makes himself, he establishes himself as a commander, but also as a statesman.
Yeah.
And he's putting, he himself puts, when he decides to plunder, he puts the works of art in the terms of the treaties with the various Italian states. And in doing that, I mean, it's so interesting, so typical of him. He's very meticulous. He doesn't want any questions asked, but he's also breaking away from the French government already. He doesn't ask their approval. But I think, I mean, I love it when you say, he says, I am the revolution, but he also moves into the Tuileries Palace.
Yeah.
So that's, and
contradiction of that, he's Mr. Revolution and he crowns himself emperor and marries a Habsburg. I mean, it is such an interesting mishmash. I mean, you do say very succinctly and aptly, I think, that the plundering represents both the best and the worst of Napoleon's career. I think Sandrine touched upon that a little bit in her introduction when she was talking about the complicated legacy that the French are coming to terms with now. But it is fascinating to see how constantly present to his mind this cultural arm of his conquest of Europe was. How is he making those choices? How is he specifically, who was working with him, and how were they deciding on which works to take from Venice, from Rome, from this this early Italian campaign?
He doesn't have time to make the choice of paintings.
Right.
He's no esprit. He asks the government in France to send him a commission. He asked them to send artists. They send 2 artists, 2 naturalists, and then 2 of the greatest scientists in France, Claude Berthollet and Gaspard Monge. And these are the really important people on the commission.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting. And I think they send these people because they are personifications of the French Enlightenment.
Right.
They know that despite their rhetoric, that that France and the Republic is the only worthy place to possess these masterpieces. They know it's going to be controversial. And so when these 2 men are unassailable, they've put France in the forefront of 18th century science. Yeah. And so, yet they're the ones who are selecting the art.
Yeah.
So
no, and it's so interesting to see that the way the rhetoric really was. These works the justification was these works need to be in France because France is now a beacon of enlightenment for the world, and these works will sort of enhance and further the cause of liberty more in our country than in yours. So that really, and those, I mean, your descriptions of how the commission worked and how then the local Venetian officials had to sort of negotiate with the demands were really, really interesting. So can you talk a little bit just about the mechanics of getting that Veronese, for instance, out of the refectory? How did that work?
Well, that was it was hard because paradoxically, the Venetians had pioneered painting in oil on canvas, and canvas in theory, one of the reasons it was in advance, can be moved. And Titian could paint in Venice and paint for Philip II in Spain. But to get it down, this Veronese, like all but one of the other paintings they took from Venice, was set into an architectural frame. It was never supposed to be moved. Right. And to get it done, they had to rip it off nails along the periphery. But that didn't hurt the paint. But there were 3 rows of nails running across the front of the painting. Yeah. They're not really sure why it was to hold it up, and they're not sure why. Conservators aren't sure whether those were put on before Veronese started to paint or afterwards, maybe when the painting started to sag. Yeah. Anyway, they have to pull it down, and the rows of nails create 3 long rows of holes. Each of those holes is about ½ inch in diameter. So it's hundreds of holes across the front.
Yeah, for 33 feet or something. What's the width again? That's insane.
Yeah. And I counted them. There were over 100 in each line. So it was very, it did a great deal of damage. Yeah. And then they roll it up. They on a cylinder, 4 paintings on top of it. Put it in this crate. The crate goes on the deck of a ship because it couldn't fit in the hold. It gets either rained on or splashed by the water. So it was very hazardous and very high risk. But I mean, it's miraculous it got there. And
it's sort of dramatic physical story didn't even end, or its displaying story didn't even end there, because so you talk about how 4 years later It's hanging. It's hung in the Louvre, in the Salon Carré, right?
Yes.
And maybe before we talk about what happens to it and how Napoleon insists on moving it again once it's already there, what about the Louvre and all this? Because this is another really crucial component of your story. And you know, you talk about how Napoleon knew when he was plundering these artworks that the Louvre would be part of that effort. That was, you described the Louvre as his collaborator, but then you also make the point that with all the collections that he brings into the Louvre, and the works he brings into the Louvre, that it becomes also one of his most important legacies. So what was happening with the Louvre? Do you want to talk a little bit about how what happened during the revolution that made it become a museum and how Napoleon used it?
Yes, it's so interesting. I mean, the Louvre was founded only 3 years before this Italian campaign.
Right.
And it was founded under the Reign of Terror, when the revolutionaries took over the palace of the French kings in the center of Paris, and decided to turn part of it into a museum of art. And then they stocked that museum with the collection of the king, which was in Versailles. They brought the paintings in from Versailles. To those, they added paintings from the churches that they'd shuttered and monasteries, and then also paintings owned by the nobility, people who had fled France. And so this dramatic example of taking the Palace of the Kings and then giving it, and also all the works of art, to the public, turned the art museum into a very potent symbol of the French Republic and French democracy. And when Napoleon brings these plundered works of art to the Louvre, whose the purpose of the Louvre was education and conservation, and he then is able to associate these works of plunder with the aims of the Enlightenment. Caroline, are you there?
I think we lost Caroline.
I think we did.
So
I'll continue on though,
yeah.
because
Yeah.
the Louvre is I won't wait for her. The Louvre is definitely also Napoleon's legacy, because he added so many paintings and works of sculpture. So just imagine the Grand Gallery, which was then a 1/4 mile long gallery between the Louvre and the Tuileries Palace, which he turned into his residence, as I said. And so there were over 900 paintings in the Grand Gallery. And some of them had come from the collections of the French kings, and to these he had added all these works of art from Italy. And the French did an incredible job of displaying these works. They hung them, they took their cue from the encyclopedia, really, and they hung them according to the history of art. So they separated all the schools: French, Netherlandish, Italian, and then they also hung the paintings chronologically. So people were dazzled by the paintings in the Louvre, and it went a long way to legitimizing this art plunder and helping, and also for Napoleon, legitimizing his reign. So I think one of the things I haven't done is explain to you that when exactly he took this on the Italian campaign. And I think it's important to understand the circumstances, because Napoleon established the pattern for plundering in Italy. And as I said, it's his very first campaign. He's only 26, and he is fighting the Austrians, who've occupied the Duchy of Milan for over a century. And he marches across Italy, and all the states that he conquers, he insists that they hand over paintings and sculpture. And he doesn't get to Venice till he starts in the spring of 1796, and then he doesn't get to Venice till 1797. And all along the way, what's interesting also about, and one of the reasons to pick this painting, all along the way, the Venetians have ambassadors in various cities. And they, all these ambassadors write reports back to Venice about what Napoleon is like and what they notice about him. And these are some of the very first reports ever made of Napoleon, and they're very astute observers of his character. And I thought that was so interesting.
Cynthia, we
So-
already have some questions from the public. So we will take the question now, and if Caroline is able to. Okay. Why?
And I'm very happy to talk about restitution. And
could you talk about how plunder like this might relate, if at all, to the art acquisition you've covered in your other books?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the question.
Could you talk about how plunder like this might relate, if at all, to the art acquisition you've covered in your other books?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, oddly, I think of, I thought of plunder when I started this as something of an extension of collecting, or, the passion and the desire to acquire things. And I actually thought of this subject long ago when I was writing the portrait of Dr. Gachet. And that told the story of a Van Gogh from the time, Van Gogh portrait from the time it was painted in 1890 to the time and it was painted just outside Paris, the time it sold in 1990 at Christie's in New York, and it became the most expensive painting ever sold at auction. And part of the history of that painting involved the Nazi regime, because the Nazis had confiscated this Van Gogh from one of their own German museums and condemned it as degenerate art. And when I read about the Nazi plundering, I would often read that Napoleon had set a precedent. And that's how I really first came to the idea of the book. But I also, hi, welcome back.
Oh my God, I don't know what happened. And I was trying and trying. I didn't want to try your cell phone while you were talking, but hello again, I apologize. Don't mind me.
Don't worry. But I also wanted to say the interesting thing about that Van Gogh painting of Dr. Gachet, which was painted right outside Paris. I realized Van Gogh, a Dutch artist, would not have gone to Paris. Like, he was a very ambitious artist, and all ambitious artists at the time, the end of the 19th century, really felt that they had to go to Paris to get training into work. And that was true of Van Gogh. And the reason they had to go to Paris is that, thanks largely to Napoleon and the Louvre, Paris had become the art capital of Europe. So the question is,
Paul,
so we're getting,
now he's really barking. Can you close the door, please? I don't know what I missed, Cynthia, unfortunately.
We just took one question from the public as you were away.
Okay, great.
But you can go on, and we will go back to the public question in 15 minutes.
Okay, all right, wonderful.
we didn't talk about responses to the Louvre. We didn't talk about restitution. We didn't really talk about Napoleon, what he knows about art. I mean, he's not no connoisseur, but I think he really understands the political power of art.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the points that you made that I thought was really fascinating was, and I hadn't really so much ever connected this as much with Louis XIV or Francois Ier or the Roman emperors, although I'm sure it was in operation in those cases to some extent as well. But this idea that you say that Napoleon used art as a weapon of war. So it wasn't just that he was trying to bolster his own cachet back home and look more imperial, look more monarchical, more sovereign, but also that there was a kind of a demoralization campaign with, if he could take the most treasured works of art from Rome and Venice, it was sort of like not just kicking these powers while they were down, but really asserting his primacy and his victory, right?
Absolutely. And he could because I think if you take one, it has to be a masterpiece, a great work of
Yeah.
art that's linked to the identity of these enemies. It's a way of really extending the victory into the future,
Yeah.
and leaving a lasting blow. And then also it gives an asset to France,
Yeah.
cultural asset to France. It's so different. Art is unique. It's so different from money or livestock. He took a lot of that, all replaceable.
Yeah, no, exactly. And you say somewhere, as Napoleon, basically as his reach expands through Europe. So as you said before, the Italian campaign, he's very young, he's not emperor yet. But by the time he finally falls at Waterloo in 1815, he's extended his French empire all over Europe. And so you also talk about, the ways in which, when adding works that he's looted from Austria, from the Germans, to his Italian collections in the Louvre, that he's really sort of also building an image of an international empire. And that, I think, you still feel that in the Louvre, that it's this French museum that really is the global collections are so astonishing.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Yeah, he goes on later as French emperor to plunder Germany, Austria, not so successful Spain. And what I think is fascinating too is the model. The Louvre then set the model of an encyclopedic museum, and then the enemies in Germany and England and Spain, they then, as soon as after he's defeated in the early part of the 19th century, they want their own national museums. And yet the model is the Louvre. They don't have just a national. In Germany, it's not a museum, not of German art, but of all Europe's greatest art, in addition to Germany.
Right. Yeah. And the Prado too, as you say, we wouldn't have these museums if it weren't for the example of Napoleon and the Louvre. So it's an incredible legacy. Can you talk a little bit, just because I love this moment, it's such a strange and interesting moment in Napoleon's history, about his second wedding. So his wedding to Marie Antoinette's grand niece, that's supposed to legitimate him in the eyes of the Habsburgs. He has the wedding at the Louvre and in the room with the Veronese, but not with the Veronese. Can you tell that story? It's such a great one.
Yeah, it's great. And of course, I thought she's the grand niece of Marie Antoinette, thinking of you, and that she had to do that same thing of coming from Austria to France and becoming French. But yes, he wants to have, and it's so interesting that he has the wedding in the Louvre.
Yeah.
So that's the most symbolic place, a place that will link him to the other sovereigns of Europe, particularly the Austrian emperor, his new
in-laws.
And so Napoleon wants it to take place in the Salon Carré, and the wedding, and he wants to have these great stands built for all the people to be there. And he says he insists that they take away all the paintings in the room. And Vivant Denon argues, you can't take this painting because it's going to damage it.
Yeah.
But he just says, I mean, he jokes really, but burn. All right, take them away, burn them.
Guess we'll burn it. And it's a wedding painting too. I mean, that makes it even worse. But yes, they bring it down again, right? And all those holes, all those nails. And how long does it stay down that second time? I don't remember.
I couldn't figure it out exactly, but it was back quite, as soon as within a year or so. I mean, it took a long time to get it. But what I was thinking, that shows to me, I mean, he is his plundering represents, those aspects of his character, his desire for greatness and glory, and yet ruthlessness in getting whatever he wants. He's ruthless with Venice, he's ruthless in the plundering, and he's ruthless with this painting. So he's not really, he's not a connoisseur, he cares more about making sure that plenty of people can squeeze into the room.
Yeah, there's a great line in War and Peace where Tolstoy says something like, his soul never darkened at the idea of basically the hundreds of thousands of deaths that he was responsible for. It's some beautiful phrase that I wish I had found for you, but it's like his soul was certainly not going to balk at doing potentially more damage to this priceless painting that he had already imperiled once in a really extreme way. And yet to kind of orchestrate this sort of pageant and this celebration of his own glory by marrying into this family is really incredible. And you also talk about the kind of, and this is where Marie Louise, his bride, was different from Marie Antoinette, because whereas Marie Antoinette's husband had in fact been raised to really distrust and dislike the Austrians, Marie Antoinette was not raised with a particular opinion about the French. Yet Marie Louise had grown up being very aware of and very horrified by what Napoleon was doing to the rest of Europe. And yet she gets shipped off to France to be married to him. And he's taking her on this triumphal tour of Paris where all the monuments are celebrating his victories. It's how much, but do we know, I mean, was he pointing out to her, do we know, was he saying from the carriage window, like, oh yeah, that's to celebrate when I crushed everybody at Austerlitz or Jena or Ulm? Was she, how much did she know? Do we know about what those monuments were?
No, we don't know. I think she was very innocent and didn't know.
Yeah.
Didn't pay attention. Yeah, and I mean, it's funny and tragic to read her letters. Oh, I feel so sorry for the poor person who has to marry him, you know, ahead of time. And then, Metternich, and I sort of love Metternich, even though he's not a nice person, but he's
a great character though. Yeah.
He's a great character. And he makes a decision, that he has to, as he puts it, something like come into the orbit of France. This is the only way. We can't keep fighting the French.
Yeah.
Because we're always losing. And he breaks the news to her that she's the one who has to marry Napoleon.
Oh my God. I know that letter where she said, I had never seen that before. She says, oh, I feel so sorry that everybody in royal circles in Europe understood that Napoleon needed to make this kind of dynastic match, not having had children with Josephine, but the fact that she was aware that that was going on and that she consciously and actively thought it would be a horrible thing to happen, and then it happened to her, is so sad. Well, maybe this is the place, talking about France and Austria. Can we talk a little bit about restitution then? So after the fall of Napoleon, and then on to the present day, the drama of these looted works.
Absolutely. So when Wellington and the Allies defeat Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, they descend on Paris, and at first they're not exactly sure what to do about the works of art in the Louvre. They don't make a decision. They do not put it into the treaty, right, with the French.
Unlike Napoleon, yeah,
the way, because he was in his treaties, or they were in the works of art were in his treaties. But soon Wellington comes to the decision, and it's really up to him because it's mostly his troops are in Paris, that the French king should return all the works that Napoleon plundered and put in the Louvre. And it's fascinating actually that he hesitates, because I think it shows, at first he was worried that and he says this, if we take away these works of art, it will undermine the position of the French king. So it shows how political they were.
Yeah.
And so but it's still left to, and Wellington says this wonderful thing. He writes a letter to Castlereagh, his foreign minister, and this letter is published in France, it's published in England, and he says that the plunder of art is contrary to the practice of civilized warfare, and that mankind has done a lot to try to stop it. And it was no longer the norm in the 18th century. And those principles that he establishes are really the ones on which the Hague Conventions are based, the first one in 1899. Yeah. So, but not everything goes back, because it's really up to each of the nations. And many of the works of art have been sent to provincial museums. Yeah. And then there's the Veronese wedding feast, and they have a whole different reason for not sending it back.
Yeah, well, so why didn't they send that one back?
Well, the French also resisted all the way along. Vivant de Nantes, made excuses. I can't find this. It really wasn't part of the whole thing.
He's another good character, by the way. I was interested to see, because I know him as a lit professor, as a writer, right? And the idea that he had this kind of important cultural role. So yeah, he's sort of dragging his feet. What else?
He's completely dragging his feet. But in this particular case, it's the problem for Venice is that it's under the rule of Austria now.
Right.
And so it's really the Austrians who have to retrieve this, all the works for Venice, including this painting. So the Austrians come to the Louvre and they tell the curators to pack, the French curators to pack up the paintings. And immediately one of the curators writes a letter saying, if you try to move this painting, it will be damaged and perhaps destroyed. They hand this to the Austrian curator, and he hands it to the Austrian emperor, who is in Paris leaving that day. And he immediately makes a decision to let the French keep the painting. I assume it's because he doesn't want to take the risk. He doesn't want to be the one, you know, he believes the curator that it's going to be the painting at great risk. They also offered to give, the French offered to give in exchange a French painting that San Giorgio Maggiore can put back into the refectory.
Oh, right. Yeah. And tell me about, because you've got a great document and you've got a great detail about that exchange. So what was the work, and then what was the valuation of the two works that were traded in that way?
It's a painting by Charles Lebrun, who was Louis XIV's court painter.
And not bad.
Yeah, he's not bad, but here he's not a disgrace. And it's a painting of Mary Magdalene at the house of the Pharisee. And what they don't tell the Austrian emperor, but what Vivant de Nantes does tell the French king, or the head of the household of the French king, is that Charles Lebrun had been valued on a Louvre inventory 4 years before at 30,000 francs, whereas Veronese's wedding feast at Cana had been valued at 1 million francs. It's, you know, it's a ludicrous exchange.
Yeah, but the Austrians went for it, right? I mean, they took it, and yeah.
Yes.
So, and what about, so I know we're getting close to now question and answer, but maybe one last question for you is just, can you talk about this work during Hitler and Vichy? Because, you know, again, there's this sort of dramatic art looting, art theft, and then the protection of art and the migration of art. What happens to this work during that period?
Yeah, it's fascinating because it had to leave Paris twice. It had to be rolled up and put in a crate and shipped out of the city because Paris was being invaded. The first time in the Franco-Prussian War, and the second time, as you say, with the German invasion. And it went, first it went before the invasion, just before the declaration of war, the director of the Louvre made sure that all the great works of art left the Louvre. And this one was one of the very, very first. And it was put in a crate, but it was also they took it out on a truck that was used by the Comédie Française for their sets. And it was
Nice.
And it moved 6 times in the course of the war to different chateaux.
Yeah. I mean, again, incredible that this painting survived. Well, Cynthia, thank you so much. I'm so sorry for my unwitting absence from the middle of our conversation. If there are more questions, I bet Saltzman would like to start submitting them to us now, or posing them to you now.
Yes. So first, there is a lot of question about the painting. First question from James Roderick. I have a question for Mrs. Saltzman. Could you discuss the feast at Cana's influence on French painting?
Yes, it was very, very influential on French painting. I think because it was of its size, its complexity, its free handling of color, and mostly the absolutely beautiful use of color. And it was, you can see it very, one of the first examples is when David is assigned to paint Napoleon's coronation. And he has, it's in Notre Dame, coronation as emperor. And he paints a picture with over 100 figures. And David himself says, he compares his painting to the wedding feast. He says, my painting is larger. He's wrong because he misstates the size of the wedding feast, but it's kind of amusing. And later, I think most importantly, the great romantic Delacroix, who says the most important thing for a painting is to be a feast for the eye. And he copies the painting, he writes about it in his journal, and he, of course, launches, he's a great colorist. And it's, even at the end of the century, the Cézanne, the painting is very important to Cézanne, who copies it and is inspired by it to paint a picture of a banquet. And then Van Gogh was also writes about it to his brother Theo, and he does it when he is articulating one of his symbolist theory of color, and yet he's writing about this 16th century painting when he was talking about this. So it had a very lasting legacy.
Stephen Wolf is asking if you're considering it as the most splendid Venetian painting in the world.
The most painted Venetian painting?
The most
Splendid.
splendid.
The most splendid. Oh, that's really tough, right? Well, for me it is.
Yeah.
For me, but there are so many great Venetian paintings. I mean, there's another Veronese feast in that did go back to Venice. That's competitive. And even in that room with the Louvre, there's there's just such amazing Venetian paintings. Another Veronese with Jupiter expelling the vices, a ceiling painting that Napoleon took from the Doge's palace.
Oh, right. Yeah, there were an inordinate number of Veroneses even on the list of works he plundered from Venice, right? It was of the total number of what, 16 or 18, how many were Veronese?
6, yes,
Yeah.
exactly, more than any other artist.
Given the choice of everything in the city, that's telling as well.
Yeah, and sometimes Veronese was criticized, for being too decorative, too beautiful, not intellectual enough. And luckily that didn't get in the way of the French, because also it's not really true.
There is a question from Armin Mortimer. Can you speak about the role of Dominique Vivant-Denon?
Well, he had a very important role, particularly in when Napoleon was plundering Germany and Austria, because there was no longer a commission. He himself went with Napoleon. And for instance, when Napoleon arrives in Berlin, in a triumphal entrance into Berlin, Vivant-Denon is there that same day. And he's the one then who makes the choice of works of art from those two countries. And the trouble is, from the Germans and the Austrians already know what's going to happen. So they have sent many of their works of art out of their capital cities. The Austrians send them to Hungary, the Germans send them to Poland, to Denmark. But he's also, but he's still, in Germany, he takes 1,000 works of art. Also, he's, and I touch on this a bit, he's very important in the way the paintings are displayed at the Louvre, and also the way they're cataloged. These catalogs are really thorough. And recently, I went back and looked at them, and they, for each painting, they explain a lot about the artist, a lot about the painting. And so I think they were absolutely dazzled by the Louvre, even if they thought that it was a victory monument. And that has a lot to do with Vivant-Denon.
So yeah, there is still the question about the Veronese influence on French painters, and when that influence started.
It started right away with, and that's what's so interesting, with the painting by Antoine Gros. He has this very difficult assignment to paint a heroic painting of Napoleon visiting soldiers who've been stricken by the plague on the Egyptian campaign. So it is a heroic moment of Napoleon visiting him, but at the same time, Gros paints a very complicated picture where that Vivant-Denon immediately points out is influenced by the Veronese because of the incredibly lush color and the atmospheric effects. And I think also because it's a very large painting, and because while it is a heroic view of Napoleon, at the same time, he doesn't shy away from the horrific situation of this hospital with the soldiers dying from the plague. So really, he's doing more than one thing at once. And I think he picks that up from seeing in the Veronese, lots of things are going on.
I think we're short of questions now, but so if you have maybe one last comment, or because we still have 5 minutes before closing the conversation.
Well, I could talk, maybe one thing that's interesting is in this restitution issue. I mean, it's certainly, the painting should have gone back in 1815, I think, but there's now in Venice, in San Giorgio Maggiore, it is owned by the Cini Foundation. And the Cini Foundation restored the refectory, and they commissioned a digital reproduction of the Veronese. So you can get a sense of what the Veronese looked like when it was in that refectory, and how it worked with Palladio's architecture, and how Palladio's architecture framed it. And I think in a way this is sidestepping this question of restitution for this painting anyway.
You know, you and I also were talking the other day on the phone about the sort of the ambivalent legacy of looting, insofar as, you know, arguably does the fact that the painting reached like Van Gogh and Delacroix and Cézanne and survived potential depredations in a refectory by being in the Louvre, does that outweigh somehow, or does that mitigate the negative side of this, you know, brazen cultural appropriation and theft? So it is an interesting and kind of complicated picture, I think, that emerges because of the sort of the plus sides that you show, along with the downsides of him taking this painting.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the things I loved about this story, is the contradictions or the paradoxes that it could, you know, have such, plundering is terrible, and it was damaged and changed its meaning and its context, and yet it was of great value to many of the greatest artists in France.
Yeah. Another question from Jens Roderick: what was a big surprise in this research?
Well, one of the surprises was that the curators of the Louvre were so helpful to me. I was very worried that they would not want to hear from me, an American.
Yeah.
And they were absolutely wonderful. They helped me whenever I went to Paris, whenever I went to the Louvre. They let me see the painting, stand in front of the painting after hours when the gallery is empty, and they let me see the back of the painting, because the painting is not hanging on the wall. It's attached to a scaffolding, and it's literally inserted into a large hole in the gallery wall, and so that they never have to move it to see the back. And they took me into this little, very, very skinny, dark room where you could see the canvas that was put on in the 1850s on the back of the painting. And it's quite amazing. Makes the painting seem even more miraculous, because the canvas, that back canvas, is very dark and frayed, and the stretcher is beaten up, and it's not.
And how did they deal with the nail holes? Are those kind of, is it glued, or the pieces of the canvas now glued together, or how does that work?
Yeah, they glue a new canvas on the back of the old canvas, and they did this, you know, first when it got to the Louvre, but then they put a second one on in the 1850s. They fill it with putty and paint.
Right.
Okay. Fill those holes with putty and paint, and they've done an amazing job because you can't see them.
Yeah. Well, since we have 2 more minutes, and since, as you know, I'm a dog person, and while I'm distressed that I lost my access to Zoom somehow in the middle, I'm shocked that none of my 4 dogs got involved in this talk, as they often do. Can you talk a little bit about the dog aspect of this painting? Because that is very charming to me. Yeah, and maybe some of the people who are actually in the painting, some faces we might know if we look closely.
Well, the dogs, yeah, I love dogs too. And Veronese clearly loved dogs. In many of his paintings, look at there's another painting in that same room in the Louvre, Supper at Emmaus. It's a wonderful dog with 2 little girls patting it. And yeah, I think with his dogs, he adds humor in everyday life, I think. And one of the dogs is looking at a cat. And if you're looking at the painting, one of the most important things to look at is the group of musicians in the very front, right below Christ, Jesus. And that in the 17th century, a commentator said that the musician in white who's playing the viola da gamba is a self-portrait of Veronese.
Yeah.
Whether or not that's true, I mean, all historians love to think so, including me.
Me too.
But what's important, he puts the musician center stage and signaling the significance of music to the life of Venice. And I think more broadly, the important place of art. So
Okay.
that's the person. That's Veronese is the familiar face, probably.
Ah,
Yeah,
someone is asking to show the painting again.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I will try. Can I get it back is the question. No, maybe not. I have to get to, I think I can.
And aren't there some other artists who are with the potential Veronese and that group of musicians? Aren't there a few other kind of known Venetian painters there?
That's something that people debate, art historians debate.
Yeah.
Whether, is this showing it?
No.
Can you see it? No, you can't see it. See, I can't get it. I'm not sure I can get it back.
So you will have to look in a bit.
Okay, hold on. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. See, there's the musician. What? Yes, for a long time, people thought that the musician in red, playing the bass or the huge cello, is Titian, and that one of the other ones is Bassano. But he's the wrong age completely. Titian is possible too, but it vaguely looks like Titian, but it's not definite. And then there were other theories about some of the other characters in the French catalogs. This started in Italy, actually, in Venice. But some of the characters, all the way to the left, are the bride and the groom. She's in white brocade and he's in red and blue and gold. And the people that are, the guests that are near them, there is a whole theory about their characters from history. And it's very unclear where that came from, and it's probably not at all true. It has nobody. People don't say that anymore. To the right of the painting are the monks. Many of them, several of the monks on the right side.
Okay. Oh, you mean the monks from the commissioning from San Giorgio Maggiore? Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, the man in I know that it's hard to see because it's covered up, but some of those figures are in black and green, not dressed in elaborate costumes.
I see.
And you can see that the ultramarine in the blue sky has survived.
Yeah, it's amazing.
He painted it. I mean, the French curators tested the paint, of course, and he did paint it. He followed the contract.
Well, Cynthia, this was so wonderful. And if I might maybe just treat the audience to a teeny bit of your prose, I was really moved by the last page of your book. And I was also pleased there's a vague Proust connection in the sense that John Ruskin was so important for Proust, and this painting was important for Ruskin. So if the audience has time, this will just take less than a minute. There in the 1840s, the Veronese convinced the British critic John Ruskin of the entire superiority, quote, of painting to literature as a test, expression, and record of human intellect. He went back many times. It was, he wrote in 1854, quote, always as if an archangel had come down into the room and were working before my eyes, end quote. And then this is your beautiful last little paragraph. The archangel was Veronese, painting at a time when artists carried out commissions and patrons chose their subjects. He was answering to the Benedictine abbot, whose decision to have him depict the miracle of Jesus changing water into wine gave the artist a subject that he handled with such brilliance that the canvas became a metaphor for the chance painters take to transform and to transfix experience, to shape life into art. It's such a wonderful book. Everybody go out and buy it, please, if you haven't already. And thank you for talking to us tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Karen. And please, yes, come to Albertine or to another independent bookstore to pick up the book.
Yes, buy it at Albertine. I hope you have lots of copies, Sandrine, yes?
Yes, there is copies.
Très bien.
Yeah.
What an honor for me to go to speak, to be able to have a conversation with Caroline and to be at Albertine.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right.
And it's have a wonderful evening. It was there is another event. We just plan another event which will take place on Sunday, July 11. It will be our last event of the season, and it's about the Tour de France.
Hmm.
More details to come on our website and our social media. Thank you very, very much. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci. Au revoir.
See. Au revoir.
Bye.
Bye.